Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 7, Section 2. And the title of this is Nationalism at Center Stage. Nationalism, the idea of putting the interest of your nation or your country above your own personal interest, exerted a strong influence in the courts, in foreign relations, as well as expansion. Remember, the whole idea behind the U.S. Constitution was to get our country to place a national interest above the interest of a state, a national interest above the interest of a country, for us to begin thinking of ourselves as Americans, not as just North Carolinians, not as just Southerners, but as a part of a country as a whole. And so we're going to be discussing that idea of nationalism today. Now, first off, in the courts. The United States Supreme Court has the sovereign duty to interpret the Constitution. They interpret laws or actions of an American president to determine if these actions or laws fit with the Constitution. And there are several important cases that have defined this role, such as Gibbons v. Ogden. Now, Gibbons versus Ogden was about a steamboat company. And a steamboat company had been granted exclusive trading rights in one state. And it was entirely up to that state of how they wanted to regulate and control commerce within their state. However, when this company began to operate in more than one state, it was a conflict of interest, because one state could not tell another state what to do. Because this steamboat company could not be granted exclusive trading rights by one state to another state. Again, states do not tell one another what to do, and that precedent, that custom, was established in Gibbons v. Ogden. Now, McCulloch versus Maryland is another one of these important laws. And in this law, in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot overturn laws passed by Congress. That federal law supersedes state law. That you cannot pass a law that violates a higher law. And that was established firmly by the U.S. Supreme Court in McCulloch v. Maryland. There have also been a number of other court cases that limited state powers, such as Fletcher v. Peck, which voided or nullified a law in Georgia which had violated a right to make a contract. Or Dartmouth College versus Woodward, saying that a state cannot interfere with a private contract. And so the U.S. Supreme Court is a very important branch of our government. They interpret the Constitution, and they have the right to overrule states. And they have the right to even overrule a president or the U.S. Congress if the actions of any of these parties violate the Constitution. And so these were several cases where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that in these instances, states or the federal government had violated the U.S. Constitution. And next, I want to discuss this idea of nationalism with you. As I said previously, nationalism is the idea that national interest come before the concerns of your region or the concerns of other countries. Nationalism is that we have a loyalty to the United States and that we have a vested interest in the United States doing well, and that we place that above even the particular interest of our region, or that we place the interest of our country above what is going on in the rest of the world. Now, John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State at this time, was guided by nationalism when he made foreign treaties with Great Britain on the Great Lakes, defining our borders and our territories. Another concept of nationalism early on in American history was the idea that we needed to expand our borders to become a powerful nation. And this was perhaps exemplified when Spain ceded Florida to the United States. This is called the Adams-Onis Treaty. Early on, from our independence all the way through the 1800s, in fact, as late as 1959, we were still expanding our borders and gaining new territories. Spain gave up Florida because they knew that Napoleonic wars or not, competing with the United States for territory on our own soil was going to end badly. In fact, they gave up any claims to the Oregon Territory, giving the United States more room to grow. And so, tied up in this idea of nationalism is national pride, but also the hope for greater power and more land and more wealth for our country. A desire to expand, a desire to compete on the world stage. So nationalism is competitive in its very nature. In fact, when we get to the First World War, we'll talk about how this nationalistic idea is going to be one of the leading causes of the First World War, and how nations competing with one another for power and territory is going to cause some problems later on. And so I wanted to show you briefly the Adams-Onis Treaty. In particular, we're talking about the acquisition of Florida from Spain, but we're also talking about the extension of territories and how, though Oregon was still jointly claimed by the United States, Britain, and Russia at this time, now we see the Louisiana Purchase, at this time simply called the Missouri Territory, and we also see that Spain is not throwing themselves in the mix on the Oregon Territory. The Adams-Onis Treaty meant they drew the northern border of their territory right here at the bottom of the Oregon Territory. But you also notice here that as of the Adams-Onis Treaty, Mexico is a lot bigger, right? Twice the size of what it is currently. And that's going to become an issue.
The following year, in 1819, negotiations with Spain led to the Adams-Onis Treaty, which established the border between Spanish and American territories in the west. The line followed the Sabine River north from the Gulf of Mexico. It jogged west along the Red River to 100th meridian and north to the Arkansas River. It followed the Arkansas west to the mountains, then ran north to the 42nd parallel, and finally straight west to the Pacific. This ended Spanish claims to the Oregon country and set the 42nd parallel as the northern boundary of Upper California.
Now, in discussing nationalism, perhaps no doctrine or decree shows this better than the Monroe Doctrine. Our fifth president, James Monroe, issued a warning to all European countries and all countries in the Eastern Hemisphere to leave the Western Hemisphere alone, to not interfere in the Americas. In fact, we effectively drew a line in the sand around the Western Hemisphere. We promised, and we broke this promise obviously, but we promised that the United States would not intervene in European conflicts, that we would not seek to be a player on the world stage. However, we warned Europe that the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, North and South America and Central America, were to be the expressed interest of the United States, and that in this area we would seek to expand our influence and become the dominant power. And this became known as the Monroe Doctrine. At the time this was issued, we were a young country. In fact, the year was 1823. Spain and Portugal and Russia and Britain all still had colonies in this part of the world. In fact, in some ways, here we are declaring our intentions to eventually boot them out by saying, this is ours, and this is none of your business, and you can stay out of it. And that's the Monroe Doctrine. In return, we said, we don't care what you do, Europe. Set the world on fire. Just do it over there.
During the first quarter of the 19th century, besides Mexico, almost every other important colony in Latin America gained independence from its mother country in Europe. However, as this occurred, certain powerful monarchies in Europe threatened to stamp out representative governments if they developed in the old colonies. That was the reason that in 1823, President James Monroe issued his now famous policy statement called the Monroe Doctrine. In it, Monroe warned the European powers that he would consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. In other words, the Monroe Doctrine warned the European monarchies that they could expect a strong response from the United States if they interfered with the affairs of any independent nation in North or South America. The ideas spelled out in the Monroe Doctrine were very important and continue to shape American foreign policy to this very day.
Another concept within nationalism is the idea of growth, a growth mentality. As settlers were moving further west, looking for land, looking for a new start, people are going west for all manner of reasons. Some for commerce. The Santa Fe Trail was a popular trading route between the Viceroyalty of Spain, now known as the southwestern United States, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and would go between the United States and New Mexico in doing business with the Spanish. Some were going west for business. Some were going to settle, to start over, to find a new life. And there are many famous stories of settlers, many famous stories of adventurers, discovering frontiers and new lands and coming in contact with new peoples. The United States had made provisions for growth even prior to the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Because from the very early days of America as a set of colonies, people had been moving into the frontiers to settle and to live and to find opportunities. And the agreement reached was that when a territory's population reached 60,000 or more, they had the right to apply to become a state of the United States. And so the idea here is that these new territories would just not be provinces like the old Rome. They would not just be acquisitions or properties, but they could become a state with full representation and a voice in their government. And that's great. And many states came into the Union under this agreement. However, we begin to see the seeds of sectionalism over the issue of slavery. Because the next question, by 1804, most northern states had abolished slavery. However, most southern states considered it an important occupation. So, should these new territories allow slavery, or should they not? And guys, this was an issue people were willing to fight over. And of course, they proved it later. And some killed for it. And some died for it. And so the Missouri Compromise was reached, and this effectively defined what is the North and what is the South. It was meant to preserve a balance of power between slave states and free. Missouri hoped to enter the Union as a slave state. It's farming territory. You drive through Missouri, big, large farms, old plantations, still somewhat warm enough where you can grow crops, and still receives enough rainfall where you can still use some cash crops and you can still have plantations. Missouri hoped to be a slave state, bottom line. Missouri's in the north. If you ever go up there, they don't drink sweet tea. They don't have Southern fried chicken biscuits. They don't say y'all. They say soda pop. They are a northern state. They are. But they came into the Union as a slave state. And a lot of people had problems with this, especially in the north. Because, and here's the real issue, prior to Missouri, there were an equal number of slave states as there were free states. And guys, we're talking about power here, because the slave states voted as one in Congress, and the free states voted as one in Congress on issues relating to slavery. And so the compromise reached was that Missouri could become a slave state, and they did. In fact, they fought in the North, even though they were a slave state. And they weren't the only slave state that fought for the North. Maryland did as well. However, they were deeply divided during the war itself. But Missouri would be a slave state. And Maine at this time, Maine had enough people, just enough to become a territory. They would be admitted at the same time as a free state. And free meaning slavery would be outlawed. And that from this time ever forward, the line between slave states and free would be the 3630 parallel, now known as the Mason-Dixon Line. And that is now the imaginary line dividing the North and the South.
As America's new boundary lines were being drawn during the presidency of James Monroe, the nation's population reached 10 million. During this period of explosive growth, new states were being added almost every year, and the issue of slavery increasingly divided the nation. Mississippi was added to the Union in 1817 as a slave state, meaning a state in which slavery was legal. The next year, Illinois was added as a free state, meaning a state in which slavery was banned. And in 1819, Alabama was added as a slave state. At that point, the number of free and slave states was equal. However, the application by Missouri for statehood as a slave state threatened to upset this balance unless the U.S. Congress took decisive action. The leaders of the northern free states claimed Congress had the right to prohibit slavery in Missouri as well as any other new states created west of the Mississippi River. But the leaders of the southern slave states strongly resisted this notion. They feared that if the balance of power was shifted in favor of the free states, slavery might be made illegal and undermine the South's slave-based economy. In 1820, Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky helped enact a law called the Missouri Compromise, designed to appease both sides. This law allowed Missouri to be admitted as a slave state, but it banned slavery from the entire region north of the Missouri Compromise line that corresponded to its southern boundary. It is interesting to note that while the Missouri Compromise was being worked out, voters in the state of Massachusetts decided to create a new free state from northern lands that had been a part of Massachusetts since early colonial times, so that when the state of Maine entered the Union in 1820, it balanced the influence of the new slave state of Missouri when it became a state the next